Welcome to our distinguished guests to the 2022 Women in Transport Conference. It is a pleasure to indeed have you join us live, both at the Stanley Hotel and internationally from where you're tuned in. Thank you so much. We know that most of you are logged in from different time zones, so this is a good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever in that you're tuning in. Thank you so much. My name is Mbeki Mwalimu. I'm the producer and founder for Back to Basics, a theater company that brings the stage back to life. I'll be joined by our signing interpreters, Chris Paul Ndongo and Shadrach Odari. On your screen currently is Chris Paul Ndongo. Now, this conference, being the 5th annual gathering, is organized by Flone Initiative to discuss issues pertaining to women in transport in Africa. We will be sharing a link to a survey asking you for demographic info, and this will be just to help us understand you better, understand everybody who's in attendance. So please take note that this information is not only anonymous, it is also very voluntary. So take time, kindly fill out these forms and submit to us. We're going to be streaming live from YouTube. This is the Flone Initiative YouTube page. And also you can join us on our join the conversations going on our social media handles, which is at Flone Initiative on social media. This is Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. This year, the hashtags we're using is WTA Conference, and the other hashtag we're using is Shape the Future. I'll repeat that again. The two hashtags we're using for the Women in Transport Conference 2022 is WTA Conference and Shape the Future. Now, before I introduce our speakers for today, or rather the speakers to kick-start this conference, allow me to just note over a few things. Over the next few days, we'll be having plenary discussions and presentations from a fantastic selection of panelists. And you can find more details from this from our website, which is www.womenandtransportafrica.org. That is www.womenandtransportafrica.org. We also know that many of you may not be able to join us, will only be joining us today and tomorrow. So those who have already registered, we will give you more information on how to join and register as the conference goes along. Also, if you have any questions throughout the days or need any assistance, feel free to ask from the chat stream. We have on-time location people that will be able to facilitate your questions and hopefully guide these questions to the necessary people who will be able to answer that. Continue to follow us on Flone. This is on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram for real-time updates. Of course, this is not possible without a lot of partners that have come on board to make this very successful. So allow me to just list the people that have made this conference very possible. We have Transformative Urban Mobility Initiative, TUMI. We have GIZ. We have FIA Foundation. We have Volvo Research and Education Foundations, VWEF. We have the World Bank. We have World Resource Institute, or WRI. We have Frederick Albert Foundation. And last, but certainly not the least, Africa Women Development Fund. So thank you to our partners. We don't take this for granted. We're very happy that you're able to come on board and talk matters in relation to women and transport in Africa. Thank you so much. Or as we say in Swahili, asanteni sana. Now, without much further ado, allow me to welcome the Flone Initiative founder and Chief Executive Director, Naomi Mwaura, to tell us the origins of this convening and why it is so important to have conversations surrounding women and transport in Africa. Naomi?
Greetings, everybody, and welcome to the 5th Women in Transport Africa Conference. My name is Naomi Mwaura, and this conference is hosted by Flone Initiative, which is a women-led charitable trust that works to design and implement interventions in public transport, conduct interventions, and also conduct research in this field, and organize inclusive dialogues and trainings that promote skill building, idea sharing, and learning to inspire new solutions to transport challenges. Allow me just to give you a brief background on Flone Initiative. And now I will call on IT to just pull up my presentation. I made a cute little presentation to go along with my talk. And so for the past couple of years, next slide, So for the past couple of years, we've worked on 4 main issues, one of them being that public transport does not meet the needs of various users. And I'm talking about women, children with disability, the elderly. And we say that public transport, not just the bus, but also the bus terminus, is not a stage where you go there to move from point A to B, but it is a stage where human interactions occur. And for most vulnerable groups, these interactions are negative. The other issue we've been working on is that public transport users are captive users. So given a choice, they would prefer to buy a personal means of mode of transport, that is a vehicle, as opposed to investing in education, business investment, medical care, and definitely savings. The issue of harassment has been rampant in public transport. We have about 88% of commuters experiencing or witnessing issues of harassment and violence in public transport. And the fourth issue, and which has brought us to here, is the barrier to entry and advancement in the industry, where workers in the industry cite public stigmatization, sexual harassment, and lack of safety in the workplace. Next slide. And so we ask ourselves, why is this the most important time to address this issue? We've seen Kenya invest in the tune of billions in terms of physical infrastructure. We have the latest project, which is the Nairobi Expressway. Has anybody here used the Nairobi Expressway in the room? Or if you're online, if you've used the Nairobi Expressway, just put your hand up. And that project costs about 65 billion US dollars. We have our Thika Superhighway, which cost about 360 million US dollars. We have another estimated $300 million in the right rail, commuter rail. But unfortunately, there's not much investment in other aspects of road transport, and that is social governance and regulations. And so you find that with time, you'll find that this physical infrastructure will increase the inequalities that are already existing in public transport systems. And so is in 3 ways. One, we conduct research and generate knowledge. Our latest one being our research, which will be presented in this conference, which is a guidebook for public transport operators on how to interact and support with persons with various disabilities. Our second mandate is behavior change. And in this way, what we work with is apologies, I think my slide is moving a bit. Advocating for behavior change, which is our second mandate, where we look at providing trainings to key stakeholders, and that is government officials, public transport organizations, and operators. Lastly, we have a movement building mandate, where we have established women in transport chapters in Nairobi, Mombasa, and Machakos. And based on these mandates, we have a couple of programs. We have Usalama wa Umma, which means public safety program, where we provide both personal and professional development trainings, as I mentioned, to government agencies, public transport companies, or in Kenya, what we call SACCOs and operators. We have a Women in Transport program that seeks to attract, retain, and advance women professionals in the industry. And our Moving Barriers program, which works on disability inclusion and disability mainstreaming in the industry. Lastly, as I mentioned, we have our research mandate. And another research that we've worked on is accessibility of public transport for women with disability and the elderly. Next slide. And so one of the key questions we always get is, what does Flone mean? So Flone was started by myself and 3 of my girlfriends in university. And we were commuting to and from university, and the issue of harassment just kept creeping up in our conversations. And at that time, we decided to implement a couple of interventions in university, one of them including self-defense training. And eventually, we realized that we were interested in this field. And the fact that I came from a family that ran matatus also further solidated the idea. And so in 2013, we decided to form the organization. And Flone Initiative is actually a combination of my parents' names, who are Florence and Nehemiah. Next slide. And so since 2013, we've had a couple of milestones. One of them, as I mentioned, the Usalama wa Umma program, which was established in 2013, and we moved around the country in Kenya in various hotspots. So what we did, we designed a crowd mapping platform that we called Report It, Stop It, and this Report It, Stop It platform enabled us to identify hotspots around the country. So with this program, we were able to move in various cities and towns, one of them including Nyeri, Nakuru, Githurai 45, 44, Bungoma, and Kisumu. And then back in 2016, 2017, we launched our Women in Transport program, which, as I mentioned, worked to retain, attract, and advance women professionals in the industry. Next slide. And so with the Usalama wa Umma, we've been able to conduct training to over 2,000 public transport operators, not just in Kenya, but also in Uganda. We have our Women in Transport Africa conference, which is why we are here today, which is now on its 5th year and has brought about 700 participants from over 35 countries. For our Women in Transport program, as I mentioned, we have 3 chapters, our latest one being the Machakos County chapter. And in research, I already mentioned some of the 2022 research that we've already published. Next slide. And so our target audience are in 4 ways. We have vulnerable groups who we consider women commuters, professionals, persons with disability, and the latest one has been the elderly, and we'd like to expand to look at women as caregivers and also children. And then the next group is practitioners who are public transport organizations, operators, and women professionals in the industry. Policymakers, we've worked with county government and government agencies. The latest project has been working with Machakos County to develop the Machakos County Public Transport Sexual Harassment Policy that has been adopted and approved. Lastly, we work with researchers to generate and bridge the data gap. Next slide. And I know for many, many years I've been the face of Flone Initiative, but there are other colleagues I have and who will also present. We have Lucy, who's our program officer, Janet, who's a program intern, Robert, Regina, and Oliver Seno. Next slide. And so part of our partners who have enabled us to do the work we've been able to successfully implement over the years is that we are part of a very strong transport network, the Socially Just Public Transport Working Group, which is hosted by the Frederick Albert Foundation, and also another working group by the African Union, which is the African Union Women in Infrastructure Network. We partner with academic institutions, one of them including the Kenya Bus Driving School. Government agencies, as I mentioned, our recent project has been with Machakos County government. We've also signed a memorandum of understanding with the Nairobi Metropolitan Area Transport Authority, known as NAMATA, to conduct trainings on gender and disability mainstreaming. We have our program supporters and our conference supporters, who we are very thankful for their support throughout the years. Next slide. There are various ways you can get involved in Flone. You can volunteer with Flone. Just send us an email at info@floneinitiative.org. You can also support the next generation of women in transport professionals by donating to us. You can join the Women in Transport database. I think all this information should be in your chat box. You can read our research reports on our website. And then next slide. And then lastly, if you're ever in Nairobi, do drop by at our offices. We are located in Pangani, and we look forward to hosting you. Over to you, Mbeki, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Naomi. It's amazing to hear that coming from a family that owns matatus. For those of us who do not understand matatus, matatu is a common phrase in Kenya that means it's this little mini buses that is common for transport. And from coming from a background of that and going to university and encountering situations that were not very, very friendly, you came up with something that is not necessarily a direct solution, but it's part of forming a solution. And we thank you very, very much. Now, because we're here today for the 3-day workshop, allow me to just go straightly to some of our speakers. And the first person who's going to give us our opening speech is Carla Dominguez Gonzalez, who is the Senior Gender Specialist in Africa Transport. She'll be speaking on behalf of Almond Waits, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Good morning. My name is Carla Dominguez Gonzalez. I'm a Senior Gender and Transport Specialist at the World Bank. And as mentioned, I'm here today representing our practice manager for Eastern Africa Transport, Almond Waits, who sincerely apologizes for not being able to be here today, but she's currently on work travel and she had some last-minute changes in her agenda. First of all, I want to thank Flone Initiative and its organizers for having the World Bank opening the 5th annual Women and Transport in Africa conference, a conference that has become a flagship event to generate and share knowledge and practices of how women experience transport in Africa. This year, we are here reunited to discuss about the future of African cities, to ensure that we shape a more inclusive and equitable future for all. It is crucial that while we are working towards the future of the cities we want, that we plan for transport systems that work for everyone. And for this to happen, we need to bring women and girls at the front of the planning, design, implementation, and monitoring and evaluation of our transport interventions. Today, we are facing a challenge as a global community. The world is becoming more urban, and African cities are experiencing some of the highest growth in the world. By 2030, 4 megacities of more than 10 million inhabitants will be in sub-Saharan Africa, and 15 cities in the region will host at least 5 million people. However, it is expected that small and intermediate cities are the ones that will absorb the bulk of urban population growth. Urbanization, yes, can give great opportunities for cities in terms of economic growth, but we need to recognize that they also bring some challenges in terms of equity. In most cases, urban investments lag behind urban population growth, and this puts an increasing pressure on transport infrastructure, resources, and services. Moreover, the urbanization of some African cities is happening by developing small and disconnected fragments and with limited transport infrastructure, which is further disconnecting cities. The spread and disconnection of the city increases the need to travel farther distances. So how does the disconnected city disproportionately affect women? One of the reasons is because women are time poor. This concept is key to understand women's mobility patterns as well as their willingness to spend time using public transport. One of the reasons is because we are aware that socially constructed roles around gender put women as the primary caregivers. And at times, women and girls are the sole responsible for household chores. Gender norms and stereotypes, among other factors, constrain women to the private sphere, as they often must juggle with household and remunerated activities. The need to combine these activities make women to be time poor, and as such, unavailable transport systems affect women disproportionately. Evidence from some studies, qualitative studies that we conducted at the World Bank, showcase that women in the last mile in Latin America, in cities that are highly urbanized, because of all the hassle that it implies to use public transport, sometimes they prefer not to access employment opportunities where they could be better paid, for example, in the center business area, and opt for working in informality closer to their home, not to access or even to stop working. All this because this combination of gender norms, household responsibility, and the challenges that are brought by public transport. In this sense, with no hesitation, we now can say that transport is not gender neutral. Women have different mobility patterns, they travel shorter distances in a multimodal way and in multi-purpose trips at off-peak hours and rely more on public transport. However, even if they constitute half of the population of the world, transport systems are often planned around one-stop trips from home to central business areas for longer distances and with a strong focus on efficiency of transport during rush hours, which are characteristics revolving around male travel behaviors. In addition, women face different mobility risks. As already was mentioned by Naomi, they suffer harsh levels of sexual harassment in public transport and related spaces. A 2015 study from Cornell University across 22 countries found that over 50% of the women surveyed have reported different situations of sexual harassment. Violence against women in public transport and spaces, unfortunately, happens constantly around the world. This is also not new to the Africa context. For instance, a World Bank study showed that among women surveyed in Freetown, Sierra Leone, 18% say they had been sexually harassed. However, the incidence of harassments were not distributed equally among all transport modes. Minibuses had the most reported incidents with 28% of women users. This contrasts with only 4% of women traveling by formal buses reporting sexual harassment. This data shows how women are disproportionately being affected by unregulated transport system. But unfortunately, in many occasions, these are their only mobility options. Violence against women and girls in public transport is not a minor issue in terms of women's rights, but also for development purposes, and it can constrain their access to economic opportunities. A study from the International Labour Organization reveals that limited access to and safety of transportation is estimated to be the greatest obstacle to women's participation in the labor market in developing countries, reducing their participation probability by 16.5 percentage points. Knowing this, it raised an eyebrow that 177 economies around the world do not prohibit sexual harassment in public spaces. Creating and implementing mobility solutions of today and tomorrow requires that we understand and address the needs and risks of a diverse society, putting special attention to the priorities of women and girls to achieve maximum economic gains, and for this purpose, more data and analysis is needed. At the World Bank, in order to generate evidence-based policy decisions, we keep documenting how women around the world are disproportionately affected by mobility barriers related to availability, acceptability, safety and security of transport, but also, as mentioned, gender norms. We look at how they travel, where they travel, and also why they are not traveling. We have developed key analytical pieces that aim to close the knowledge gaps on gender and mobility in key areas. Our work encompasses, for instance, a systematic literature review on what works and what doesn't to bring gender consideration into transport, an analysis of mobility barriers that low-income women face in the last mile in Latin America and in rural Africa, where we also put some focus on non-motorized transport. We also have carried several studies of the barriers that women face in the transport sector in cities in Africa and Europe around all the career cycle in their recruitment, retention, and promotion. I really want to highlight that at the World Bank, we are working with our clients to ensure that these analytical pieces are operationalized, as you can see in a discussion that we will be having tomorrow. I also want to stress that while we are making progress in recognizing that transport infrastructures and services impact women and men in different ways, there is a need to recognize that women are not an homogeneous group. Gender inequalities often interact with other forms of inequality, such as class, sexuality, immigrant status, or disability, and exacerbate each other. Intersectionality, a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw over 30 years ago, refers, in her own words, to a lens or prism that helps us see how people's social identities overlap and create compounded experiences of discrimination. We need to bring to the center of our conversation, to the decision-making arena, the voices not only of women and girls, but of women and girls with overlapping characteristics. Nowadays, it's also imperative that we don't forget the nexus between climate, gender, and transport. Climate change is a threat multiplier. According to the UN, when disasters strike, women are less likely to survive and more likely to be injured. This due to the disparities created by gender inequality with mobility and decision-making. Another World Bank study conducted in Flone and Kumasi revealed that while in general, more people in low-income areas consider they suffer a great negative impact due to floods, approximately 40 to 50% of women in low-income areas consider their lives were impacted a great deal compared to 20 to 26% of females living in higher income areas and which are more resilient to floods. Understanding how women and men travel and the carbon intensity of the modes that they are using is also relevant for the decarbonization agenda. By promoting a modal shift for cleaner modes of women, we can contribute to decarbonization. However, for this to happen, the specific mobility constraints that women face have to be addressed along the planning process. Or else, as captive users, as mentioned by Naomi, they might shift to cars, which are considered a safer option in many cases. Finally, as we all know, there is a gender gap of women's employment in the transport sector. According to data from the International Labour Organization, in 2018, females represented less than 20% of the global transport workforce. Women are facing barriers along all the employment cycle, as I mentioned, on recruitment, retention, and promotion. But we also know that certainly girls face gender stereotypes since early ages to enroll in STEM careers. It is also more common for women to have less job security and lower paid jobs than men across the transport sector. If we want more gender-responsive planning and policies, it is key to support the meaningful participation of women at all levels and all the career cycle, as is showcased in a World Bank-led study for the transport sector in Kenya. Given this panorama, what are we doing about all these issues? From the World Bank Transport, we are working on key areas, including, but not limited to, first, improving gender data collection. While we recognize that collecting and disaggregating data by sex is a major step, we are going beyond. We are improving our data collection instruments to ensure that methodologically and in terms of content, they are sound to the high-end standards to ensure that data collection has high quality and that for example, as we were mentioning, the challenges that women with overlapping characteristic face are also revealed in these studies. We are also taking advantage of technology and big data to capture the mobility patterns of different groups. We are also conducting qualitative research to bring on board the voices of women with different characteristics. Our projects include meaningful consultations at several stages of the project planning, design, and implementation, and we target specific groups such as women, girls, but also people with disability, the elders, to take into consideration the needs into the transport planning and operational design. Second, as we mentioned, there's a big gender gaps of women employed in the sector. So we are focusing on bringing more women where transport and infrastructure decisions are made. Evidence shows that several of the barriers that women face are at entry, in the transition from school to work. Therefore, in several of our projects, for example, in the recently approved Burundi and Mozambique, we will provide with internship programs and educational training skills for women to advance in their transport-related careers, while ensuring that we also have a gender action plan to address the barriers that they face in their recruitment, retention, and promotion. Third, we are also addressing transport services issues that disproportionately affect women besides road rehabilitation maintenance. Even if evidence show, for example, that in rural areas, there are positive effects of rehabilitating roads in terms of improving women's accessibility to services and employment opportunities, we know that the story is not complete if we also don't understand the barriers they use to access services. Therefore, a project in rural areas in Mozambique is working on the design of a pilot to improve access to services in rural Mozambique for women by designing people-centered interventions that can address the demand needs of different sectors, including women, as I mentioned, but also people with disabilities. Fourth, besides focusing on gender-responsive public transport, we are also stressing the relevance of non-motorized transport and active mobility into our project. Evidence from Lima, Peru, a qualitative study that we recently concluded, a qualitative and quantitative study, suggests that providing bicycle lane will increase the probability of women of using bicycle between 13 and 18%. However, providing infrastructure is not enough. This has to be designed taking into consideration the environmental design features that women need, but at the same time, understanding the barriers that they face in terms, for example, of self-efficacy or how able they feel to using bicycles themselves. Fifth, we are defining a clear pathway to address sexual harassment in public transport. Several of our projects create mechanisms to prevent and respond to sexual harassment in public transport, and interventions go from bystander interventions that show the community how to intervene in cases of sexual harassment, communication campaigns, supporting our clients in the development of protocols to prevent and respond to violence in public transport, making the links with the different referral pathways that are responding to violence against women, supporting in the development of code of conducts, and training transport operators. But at the same time, we are heavily focusing in the infrastructure, and in some of our projects, we are now conducting safety audits with a gender perspective to ensure that we provide with environmental design features for violence preventions that include, for example, lighting, openness of the public space, visibility. And we are working with different consultants, not only to do these audits, but to make sure that the information derived from there are translating into specific technical design features for the consultancy firms that will be conducting the designs. Given these examples, as a transport community, we need to keep working on addressing the barriers that women face in the transport sector from the user and the employment side. This is an important task, and the transport sector has a very relevant role. But I really want to stress that it cannot be done exclusively and successfully by only transport stakeholders. More and more intersectional collaboration is needed with the ministries of gender, education, health, employment, and with civil society organizations doing key work on the matter and collecting data as Flone initiative. Events like the one today are key for enhancing networks, collaboration, and to share knowledge and experiences on what works and what doesn't to improve the transport sector for women. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carla. Carla is a senior gender specialist to Africa Transport from World Bank. Our next keynote speaker is going to be Margarita Martinez-Diaz from the University of Catalonia.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to take part in this Congress. I think it's a very nice organization and it's important to exchange ideas in order to find solutions to the current problems that mobility faces. Well, I was asked to speak about the mobility of the future, and my first thought was how the mobility of the future should be. Because some years ago, this was the ideal of the mobility of the future. Even in films, we could see this kind of futuristic cities with flying cars and whatever. I don't know if you like this kind of city, but in my case, no. Nowadays, fortunately, I think all of us agree that the mobility we need is a mobility that is efficient, that is safe, that is sustainable, and that is inclusive. But this change of mind was not spontaneous. It was a consequence of our awareness because we are suffering a lot of externalities related to transportation, pollution, congestion, lack of equity. So I have some premises in order to really reach this objective, this ideal mobility. So the first premise is a bit strange, perhaps, but I think we are paying too much attention to technology. And I am a researcher, I'm a civil engineer, so I use technology. For me, technology is very important. But technology should be a tool to achieve our objectives and not an end in itself. We have the example of the autonomous vehicles here. So it's very common to see advertisements in which we can read that autonomous vehicles are going to solve all our problems in terms of safety, in terms of efficiency, in terms also of equity. But this is not true. And in fact, this has been demonstrated by researchers. So you can see this picture, which is very simple. So you have in the vertical axis is the flow. This is the number of vehicles that can cross efficiently a section of a road. So we want flow to be as high as possible. And you have in the horizontal axis the time gap. The time gap is the distance, but in units of time, between two consecutive vehicles. Nowadays, human drivers maintain more or less a time gap of 1 second with the vehicles ahead. But autonomous vehicles, for the sake of safety, are being programmed with a time gap that is of 2 seconds. And if you see, flows, so the columns, are much lower. So autonomous vehicles would even lead to an increase of congestion. This means that autonomous vehicles are something that is no good. Not exactly, but we must introduce them properly as any other technology. So we don't need vehicles in which we can sleep while driving. This is the first thing. And the second thing is that we need traffic management. This is, we need vehicles that are not autonomous, but are automated and that exchange information among them and cooperate in order to achieve the optimum, but for the overall traffic. And not only this, it would not be a good idea that any of us or the people that nowadays have a car have an autonomous vehicle. So the idea is that this kind of automation is implemented in the public transportation. More examples, the Hyperloop. So the Hyperloop is or will be technologically feasible, but do we really need to put the focus on such a transportation mode? I think we have great challenges and we should put our efforts in improving current transportation modes. And the third example is that of artificial intelligence. Again, I'm not saying that artificial intelligence is not good, of course not. We are already using it, also big data. But there is like a trend and artificial intelligence can do everything, and this is not true. I think all of us know the cases of the human resources departments in some companies that use artificial intelligence algorithms, and the result was that only white men in the middle age were chosen as candidates for a job. So we must use artificial intelligence, but we must control it, and we must combine artificial intelligence with the basic theories and models of transportation engineering. So the second premise is that mobility must be people-oriented, because most of our trips are done because we need to access an activity. So it is possible also that we move only because we want to move, we want to go for a walk. But most of our trips have another goal: access the hospital, access the supermarket, access our work, access the school. So mobility should be a right. And at the moment, there is no equity. We have more or less, depending on the scenario, but we have more or less the same offer. But this is not how we must proceed, because each of us have different needs. So we need a different offer. One particular example that was already commented before is the gender perspective in transportation. Really, we have these different mobility patterns. We have also a different perception of safety. We have also these problems of harassment, and these problems must be solved. So it's key. And these kind of problems are not only do not happen only in Africa or in Latin America. Here on the right part, you can see a slide of a survey that one of my students launched some months ago. And as you can see, most of the women responded said that they have suffered a kind of harassment in the public transportation in Barcelona. So first, not all this harassment was very severe. So I think even no nice comments are included in this number. But anyway, why should women suffer even from bad comments? And second, it's possible that most of the people that wanted to participate in the survey have suffered harassment, and that's why the numbers are, or this first number is so high. But if we look at the second number, and we see that most of the respondents said that they have suffered or seen harassment more than once per month, this is clear, indicating us that we have a problem also in Europe. Of course, women are a very important target group, but we also need to answer to the needs of people with different ages, people with different physical conditions, people that live not only in city centers, but also in rural areas or more isolated areas. One famous case of the inequity in the transportation sector was that of the dummies, these kind of puppies that are used to test the safety systems in cars. Because until some years, they had only one shape, again, the shape of a man in the middle age. Nowadays, this problem is solved, but this is a clear example of how important is to pay attention and to take into account the diversity of users. One third example of the importance of taking people into account will come in the future. This picture that you can see there is the famous trolley problem. So in the picture, this vehicle has no brakes, and if it continues its route, it's going to run over 5 people. But there is a man that has the power to change this route so that the vehicle only runs over 1 person. And the question here, the ethical question is, should the man do this in order to save 4 lives? Or should Earth think fate wanted that 5 people die? So this is a question that must have an answer in the future, because automated vehicles will take such decisions in case of an accident, in case of a dangerous situation. Or more properly, not automated vehicles, but governments that must decide how we researchers or programmers must program the algorithms that will give the path to these decisions. So this kind of topics are going to be more tricky than technological topics. So technology runs. With technology, we can achieve everything, but humans must be always in the center, because we are complex. We are complex, and these problems must be faced. And equity must be also introduced as a matter of interest, because and people, this people-centered orientation. Because if we are a company and want to succeed, we must take into account what people need and what people want. This is a picture of the bikes that come from sharing systems in China that failed. So this is a loss of money. And also administrations public transportation offer does not address our needs, probably if we have a car, we will continue using this car. And even more serious, if we don't have a car, perhaps we don't have the possibility to access the job, the school, the university, or the hospital. Another example is, another example of how important it is to have people in the center of the designs. Again, these are data from a survey about autonomous vehicles made by the European Union. So on the left, the question was if people would feel comfortable traveling as passengers in an autonomous vehicle in 3 scenarios: with a supervisor in the vehicle, with a remote supervisor, or without a supervisor. And on the right, the question was, okay, you are not the passenger of an autonomous vehicle, but you are a pedestrian, or you are a cyclist, or you have another traditional car, but in their surroundings, you are sharing the road with an autonomous vehicle. Would you feel comfortable? The pink and red colors belong to the respondents that say, I would not feel comfortable or not comfortable at all. And as you can see, there is a high share of people who would not feel comfortable. But still, the focus is put on autonomous vehicles. So really, we must think, we must give or make priorities and choose what is important first. And after that, more things can come. The third premise is that mobility must be clean, but truly clean, because again, the focus is put on electric vehicles. Of course, electric vehicles are better in terms of consumptions and also emissions than combustion engines vehicles. But if they still have accidents, and we would have other problems because there is no enough electricity to feed such quantity of vehicles, and we should have to exploit a lot of resources to elaborate the batteries. So electric vehicles are a good solution as long as they are again introduced as public transportation. So the backbone of any mobility offer, of any mobility transportation system must be the public transportation. And after that, of course, we can also promote soft modes of transportation, cycling, walking, but this should be something additional, because elderly people or women with children, or perhaps we have a lot of bags, we cannot cycle, or perhaps we can, if the distance is very long, we cannot walk. So again, public transportation must be in the focus. The fourth modality is that we must think in a multimodal way, because, and especially women with this kind of chain trips that we make in order to leave the children in the school and then go to the supermarket and then go to the job. So it's very strange that nowadays one person only uses one mode of transportation to go from his or her origin to his or her destination. And in most occasions, this is really hard to reach the destination, either because we have some stretch without any modal transportation offer, or because we have it, but we must wait a lot, or we must lose a lot of time. So this is something that must be handled also. Of course, we can handle it and address this problem in a very technological way with the mobility as a service. As you know, this idea of mobility as a service is that we would have only one provider. We could even have an app in our phone. We could even pay a flat rate per month, and we would be able to choose each day between a lot of transportation modes, and we would receive like a suggestion in order to do our trip, a multimodal trip, but seamless, without waits. Of course, this is very nice, and this is technologically possible. But should we wait till this is possible, until this is implemented in every country? I think not. I think nowadays it's also possible to coordinate the different transportation stakeholders in order to make multimodality easy with the tools and with the transportation modes we have. And then when we have this, and we have more time and more possibilities and more money, because money is also necessary, then we can go and try to reach this perfect solution. The fifth premise, and the last one, is that if we have different tools, we have different scenarios, people is more awareness of how important mobility is, we should do different things, because to some point we are doing the same things as before. So as with electric vehicles, okay, I change one vehicle for another vehicle. This is not the option. And I have here some examples. So the first one is traffic management, because even when we try to promote a modal shift, we will always have cars and buses in our roads. So we should try to manage this traffic so that we have no congestion. And we can do this in two different ways. Imposing static traffic management strategies, this means we have some measure, and this measure is always like this. Or using the technology that we already have, and there are even cheap technologies, in order to, in real time, control how is the situation of the traffic, and then process this information and take the decisions in real time that are the better to solve the current situation. I have in the pictures two clear examples. So we have in the left two lanes that are for public transportations or vehicles with a high number of passengers, which is good. This is a good measure because we are trying to promote the use of public transportation, or if we use private cars, at least these private cars should have more than one passenger. So this is good. But what happens if in the other lanes there is a lot of congestion or perhaps an accident? We cannot take advantage of these lanes to solve this particular problem. If we have the situation on the right in which we have a panel that in real time shows a message and gives an advice or a suggestion or sometimes an order, in this case, it is saying these lanes are only for vehicles with more than 3 passengers, and this is amazing. But if there is any problem, these lanes could be also used for other purposes, also for emergency vehicles or whatever. So this is not so difficult to do, and we must change our mind and try to implement this kind of measurements. And last examples for those of the car following models. So I'm not going to go in depth into this, but these are like very basic models in traffic engineering because they try to mimic how consecutive vehicles or consecutive drivers behave. These models were designed or defined a lot of years ago, and of course they were defined thinking in a human as a driver. And nowadays that we have automation, which is not the same as autonomous vehicles, but we have automation in the cars, in the buses, so there are systems that can help the driver. We are using more or less the same car following models, only changing some parameters or some default values. So my thought and that of my research group is that we should start from scratch because we have a different situation. Also, when we are trying to, this is something that for the administrations is very important. So we have a lot of people that want to go from A to B. Okay, so administrations and researchers and also companies analyze which specific transportation modes they are going to use to go from A to B. So, and perhaps 30% are going to use the private car, 20% are going to use the public transportation. So these numbers come from other types of models that are discrete choice models. But discrete choice models have a limitation, and this is that they suppose that one person is going to reach his or her destination using only one transportation mode. And as what we have seen before, this is not the case usually, because, for example, people that live in rural areas and work in the city center, they must use different transportation modes. This change trips, this multimodality, I have spoken before. And there are new models, but they are not being used, this agent-based model. So this is the last premise. So we have new tools that are easy, that are not very expensive, that require some technology, but not the most advanced technology, but still we do the same things as before. So as a conclusion of my speech, we must, of course, take advantage of technology, but much more important is to have people in the center of any policy, of any strategy, of any design. And in order of this to be possible, we need diverse teams. We need diverse teams in the design process and also in the decision-making process. Of course, teams with women, with men, but also teams with people coming from having different backgrounds and different interests. People from the administrations, companies, users, researchers, because all of us, even if we want to do our best, we have some ideas in mind. So the best solutions can only be found if we combine these ideas, if we exchange these ideas, and we agree in good and nice decisions. So thank you very much. That was my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Margarita, for that amazing presentation. She was our second keynote speaker. And I like what she says. She says mobility should be a right. Thank you for that insightful presentation. Our third and last keynote speaker, definitely not the least, is Jody Evans from ITF. ITF is International Transport Federation. Jody Evans will be joining us to give the presentation as a third keynote speaker.
It is a real honour to be here with you all today in this space dedicated to women in public transport to provide some reflections on shaping the future of mobility, and in particular to highlight the role of women public transport workers within that. My name, as you said, is Jody Evans, and I'm the Women Transport Workers and Gender Equality Officer at the International Transport Workers Federation, the ITF, the global trade union federation of 670 unions representing over 18 million transport workers worldwide. So I'd like to start my contribution by sharing the reflections of a woman public transport worker in Uganda. Ladies in this industry, we are discriminated because of our gender. People think that women cannot drive, cannot do this and this and this. And yet we are capable of doing everything. This honest and powerful reflection was included in a short film that the ITF made about the power of informal transport workers. A film that was made 5 years ago, but unfortunately this reality still remains for many women in the informal transport economy and for other women in public transport around the world. As in other sectors of transport, the systemic exclusion of women from decent and secure work is a persistent issue in public transport. Gender stereotypes persist, which can be expressed as negative attitudes about women's abilities and suitability to work in public transport. And in practice, this is exhibited in differences in the status and conditions of the jobs done by women and men, with women more likely to be in the jobs that are lower paid and more precarious. These are issues of significant concern to women working in public transport. Such as a lack of maternity rights, long working hours, poorly designed vehicles and uniforms, wage inequality, exposure to violence and sexual harassment, and inadequate facilities, including safe access to decent sanitation facilities. And all of these issues can have a really profound impact on the retention of women in the sector. And the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed and exacerbated existing harmful inequalities. In Nairobi, for example, there are reports from taxi and matatu workers that men were getting preferential treatment for the few jobs that remained, while women workers were told to stay home. This forced women into even more precarious work with longer working hours, increased pressure, and without provisions for support or leave. And women in public transport also faced higher levels of physical and verbal abuse, including sexual coercion from the public, police, and from colleagues. Isolation and lockdowns also increased women's exposure to domestic violence. As we emerge from the pandemic, public transport services are vital to rebuild the life of cities, and there is an opportunity to adopt a gender-responsive approach to recovery to ensure that inequalities are not reproduced, perpetuated, or intensified. Public transport in itself is a form of care and has the potential to transform the quality of life for women who are its biggest users. The expansion of public transport is vital to provide women with safe, affordable, equal access to their place of work and engagement with a wide range of rights, including the right to work and rights at work, the right to education, the right to healthcare, and the right to political participation. The expansion of public transport also strengthens green and decent work opportunities for women in transport, including the chance to shift from precarious or informal work into formal employment. There are many new ideas, concepts, and approaches that are being developed in cities and within public transport to respond to different challenges and to improve services, sustainability, and safety. Some of these new concepts include the 15-minute or 30-minute city concept, where city residents are able to meet most of their needs within a short walk or bicycle ride from their home. New mobility options such as e-scooters and cycling, as well as smart city projects where digital data is used to improve services, sustainability, and safety, and technological developments such as cashless payments and more. The introduction of new technologies brings potential benefits, but also risks for women in public transport. For example, women are often at the sharp end of automation, as their jobs in ticket sales and customer service functions may be particularly at risk. However, technological changes in vehicle operation may improve the job of driving for women, and digital employment platforms can provide flexible transport work that is appealing to women workers. However, there are issues with equal access to vehicle ownership and technology, as well as how to ensure decent work, including employment status. Women working in the gig economy also face a higher threat of violence and harassment. Some cities are announcing programs that promote the employment of women workers and the operation of the new electric buses. But these programs are often incomplete and do not provide sufficient support for women workers to be able to take advantage of the opportunity. In Bogota, Colombia, the government announced 450 of the new 1,500 electric bus drivers were going to be women. Although the announcement was made in July 2021, 6 months later, the electric bus company in charge of the operations, Green Mobile, had only hired 15 women drivers due to a lack of sufficient qualifications from candidates and a lack of support needed for women drivers. Many of these new ideas and developments will shape urban life for workers and citizens for decades to come. Women's needs in as public transport users are often prioritised over the needs of women as public transport workers. However, the two aspects are interconnected and can be mutually beneficial, and so women public transport workers should not be forgotten. And public transport can only be gender responsive if there are women employed in the industry at every level. It is therefore essential to create decent and secure work opportunities in the sector, which both attract and retain women and challenge occupational segregation. As cities evolve and adapt to respond, for example, to the COVID-19 pandemic, the climate crisis, and other challenges and priorities that emerge, there is an opportunity to ensure that public transport is organised to meet social and economic priorities, including the provision of good jobs for women and men workers. To achieve all of this, the ITF is highlighting the following policy demands that provide our vision for women in public transport. Strengthen women's employment and promote decent work in public transport, end violence against women transport workers, including through ratification and implementation of the ILO Convention 190 on ending violence in the world of work. Introduce technological change in a way that advances gender equality, and involve women workers in public transport decision-making. These demands also reflect our global priorities for women transport workers. Our ambition is to win the space for women as stakeholders, to find and enable women leaders, and build activity that delivers results for women workers. Earlier this month, we published a major new report on just cities and women public transport workers in Latin America, which explores the current situation for women public transport workers across the region, as well as the new mobility initiatives that will present new challenges for women public transport workers. The report lays out 10 key points, developed in conjunction with the visions of women trade union representatives in the region, to define a just city for women public transport workers. And while the report focuses on Latin America, the findings and recommendations can easily be applied to other cities around the world. Our report states that just and feminist cities must provide a better quality of life, so citizens have equal access to public spaces and public services for care, health, education, and employment opportunities, and the freedom and ability to move freely in the city. They must be smart. Smart technologies are used to make women's lives and work easier by creating decent and secure job opportunities for women, and planning processes take a bottom-up, user-centered approach, involving trade unions as stakeholders in consultations. They must be resilient. There are positive adjustments towards sustainability and transport policies that support operators and workers in rapid change and adaptability. They must be sustainable. Climate policies that improve and expand public transport are promoted, including public transport powered by clean energy and technology. Just and feminist cities must be inclusive. Policymaking and financing starts from the embodied experiences of different population groups, and the intersectional approach is applied that is responsive to the diversity of needs and inequalities emerging from gender, age, race, ethnicity, or ability. They must be creative. Alternative urban futures and spaces are imagined and created with the active involvement and participation of transport workers, unions, and marginalized groups in the transformation of our cities. They must be safe. All citizens can live and work in the city, and public transport is a space free of violence, harassment, or abuse. They must be equal. Dignified, equal, and inclusive opportunities are provided for women workers. Women's voices are heard, and women's rights are respected in social dialogue, negotiation, and consultation, and women are involved in shaping public transport policy. They must be caring. Networks of care and support are provided in the workplace and beyond. And they need to encourage activism as a fundamental part of societal change. Efforts to better engage and represent women in decision-making about public transport is fundamental, and there should be gender impact assessments using gender disaggregated data, gender responsive planning, gender responsive investment, and proactive policy interventions. Labour impact assessments that include gender and the use of gender disaggregated data are really vital to help to better understand the economic and social impacts of public transport projects, the specific impacts for women, and to identify how policies can be developed to meet the needs of transport workers, ensuring that equality issues are addressed. The ITF has commissioned labour impact assessments, including gendered impacts, in Nairobi in 2019, Dakar in 2020, and Abidjan in 2022, to look at the potential impact of the introduction of new bus rapid transit systems on informal transport workers' livelihoods and working conditions. The assessments present recommendations for the introduction of BRT, outlining practical steps for a just transition from informal to formal employment in transport. Visibility is given to the experiences and work of women, and recommendations include steps related to women's employment and gender equity and addressing gender-based violence. This is what we're doing in the transport workforce, but for it to be effective, there will need to be joint leadership, commitment, and action from all stakeholders in the sector. In particular, these measures must be negotiated with trade unions, by